Loneliness has a quiet way of entering someone's life, often without being noticed at first. For Michael, a 68-year-old man living in a small town in the Midwest, it crept in after his wife passed away and his children moved to different states for work. In the early days, he tried to keep himself busy. He mowed the lawn, fixed small things around the house, and spent hours watching television shows he hardly paid attention to. But in the quiet moments, when the house grew too still and no one's voice echoed in the hallways, the weight of loneliness became undeniable. He remembered the years when the kitchen had been full of life, his wife humming while cooking, the children running around, their laughter filling the air. Now the kitchen was silent. He often made simple meals, sometimes just soup from a can, not because he enjoyed it but because cooking for one seemed pointless. Meals no longer felt like events to look forward to but rather tasks to be finished. Evenings, once the warmest part of the day, turned into long stretches of solitude where the only sound was the ticking of the old clock on the wall. At first, Michael tried to ignore his loneliness, convincing himself that it was simply part of aging. "This is how life goes," he muttered. "People grow up, loved ones leave, and you just learn to live with it." But ignoring it did not help. It only grew heavier. There were days when he would sit in his recliner, staring out the window at neighbors walking their dogs, families riding bicycles, and couples holding hands, and he felt invisible. It wasn't anger that consumed him, but a deep sense of being forgotten. One Sunday, while driving past the community center, he noticed a sign: "Senior Coffee Morning every Wednesday at 10 a.m., everyone welcome." He slowed down, reading it twice, but then drove on. The thought of walking into a room full of strangers made him nervous. He hadn't introduced himself to new people in decades. What would he say? What if nobody spoke to him? The fear of rejection felt even sharper than the loneliness itself. Still, that night he thought about it, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he promised himself he would go the following week. Wednesday came and Michael nearly talked himself out of it. He told himself he had errands to run, that he was too tired, that he could always go next week. But something stronger inside him pushed back against those excuses. He put on a clean shirt, combed his thinning hair, and drove to the community center. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the door, but the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of gentle chatter welcomed him. A woman at the entrance smiled and said, "Good morning, come on in." That small gesture made him feel a little lighter. He sat at a table with three other people who introduced themselves quickly: George, a retired firefighter; Helen, a widow who enjoyed gardening; and Arthur, a quiet man who used a cane. The conversation started slowly, mostly polite comments about the weather, but soon stories began to flow. George told a funny memory about his days at the firehouse, Helen shared her pride in the roses she had grown, and Arthur spoke about his grandchildren. Michael found himself smiling, even laughing, and for the first time in a long while he felt part of something again. That single morning did not erase his loneliness, but it cracked open the door to connection. He began attending every Wednesday, and over time the faces at the community center became familiar, even comforting. Helen brought homemade cookies one week, and Michael found himself telling her about his wife's favorite recipes. George invited him to join a walking group that met twice a week at the park, and although Michael was hesitant, he gave it a try. Soon he discovered that walking alongside others while sharing small conversations eased the silence that had haunted his days. The more he engaged, the more he realized that loneliness wasn't something to hide from but something to face with courage. He learned that many of the people he met at the community center were also battling the same quiet struggle. Some had lost spouses, others had children living far away, and a few had never married at all. There was comfort in knowing he was not alone in feeling alone. Together, they created small rituals that gave their days meaning: coffee mornings, afternoon walks, even sharing books or music recommendations. Michael also started reconnecting with his family in a more intentional way. Instead of waiting for his children to call, he began phoning them first, asking about their lives, sharing stories, even learning to use video calls so he could see his grandchildren's faces. At first, it felt awkward, as if he were intruding, but he soon realized that his children appreciated the effort. They wanted him in their lives, they just needed a reminder that he was reaching out. Those video calls became bright moments in his week, and his grandchildren often laughed, teaching him how to play simple online games or showing him their school projects. Yet loneliness did not vanish completely. There were still evenings when the house was too quiet, when memories felt heavier than hope. But Michael learned to face those moments differently. Instead of surrendering to the silence, he filled it with purpose. He began writing letters to his late wife, telling her about his days, his new friends, and the funny things his grandchildren said. Though he knew she would never read them, the act of writing helped him feel close to her, as if her presence lingered in his words. One winter evening, after returning from a community potluck dinner, Michael sat by the fireplace and reflected on how much his life had shifted in just a year. Loneliness had once felt like an endless tunnel, dark and suffocating. But now he could see small lights along the way: friendship, connection, family, and the courage he had found within himself. He realized that loneliness is not always something you can completely erase, but it is something you can soften with love, effort, and openness. He whispered softly to himself, "Life isn't over at 68. There are still people to meet, stories to hear, laughter to share." And in that moment, he felt a quiet peace. Loneliness had taught him something he never expected, that even in the later chapters of life, the heart remains capable of reaching out, connecting, and finding joy again.